Let's be brutally honest right now. That's a big question.
I'm looking for someone who doesn't want to go to base camp, but they want to go to the very top.
Whether it's here, India, New York.
Civilization was born at happy hour.
That's what wins. That's what stands out. That's what people are interested in. That's what I want to know. The Hospopreneurs Podcast with James Henderson. Hello and welcome to the Hospopreneurs Podcast. Dr. Simon Eassom is an experienced leader, business executive, and strategic thinker, and today joins me as the CEO and Executive Director of Food Frontier. Simon has had a distinguished multidisciplinary career as a university professor with a PhD in applied ethics, freelance investigative journalist on health and food economics, and mid-career worked in various executive roles for IBM, leading on the use of big data, predictive analytics, cloud computing, and artificial intelligence. He's consulted with numerous organizations on the impact of technology on the future of work, education, and food, and currently serves on the board of the Australian Council of Professions as its Chief Futurist. I feel like I say this all the time, but this is really a great episode, and I hope that you enjoy listening today. Hello, and welcome to the show, Simon.
Great to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you on. We've had an amazing chat before recording today. We've gone to all sorts of really interesting places. I've learned about many of your interests, and in history, you've been a professor, a rock climber, all sorts of things all around the world. So I really appreciate you sitting down with me today and opening up this episode. So thank you again.
Great, you're welcome. Looking forward to it.
Simon, as you know, the first question that I like to ask on the program is a crazy hospitality story or exceptional hospitality experience, something that I open every episode with. I'd love to know what you've brought to the show today.
Sure. Look, as a young man, I got the typical wanderlust, spent a lot of time traveling around, hitchhiking my way around the world as a very young man, and carried on in the future with the early days of mountain biking. I rode my bike all over parts of Africa, Asia. But one particular story that I think is amusing is the hospitality you receive when you turn up in some of these places. And we're talking a long time ago, we're talking 40 odd years ago at least. And you rock up and you're on a mountain bike, you're 6'4" tall, you're sort of white skinned, blue eyed. And, some of these local communities have not really seen anybody like you before. And of course, they're always very welcoming and very generous. So I was in a Berber village in North Africa at one stage, and I'd ended up staying there for 3 or 4 days. And when I was leaving, they decided they would have a village feast. And as the guest of honor, of course, I'm treated with the greatest respect and offered the best food. Well, the best food, to my shock and surprise, was the fact that they'd, spit roasted a sheep, but I was offered the head. And in particular, directed in no uncertain terms that the delicacy was mine to enjoy with the eyeballs. So, that first experience of eating a sheep's eyeball from somebody who'd come from a very, very insular and very narrow eating framework, post-Second World War, last of the baby boomers with very plain, simple food, and recognizing that this was a great honor and there's absolutely no way you could decline or refuse. And so, there you go.
And now today you live a vegan lifestyle as well, is that right?
Yeah, I'm not a vegan as such, because veganism means all sorts of different things. And particularly in terms of food, I wear leather, for example. But in terms of food choices, at home, my wife and I, she's more stringent than I am, basically don't eat animal products or dairy products.
So when you think about that experience, taking you back to that story, what would you do today if that sort of thing happened? And that's a very difficult situation to be in.
It's a really interesting question. Actually, in my own personal beliefs, I don't have an issue with eating animals as such, per se. I have an issue with animal agriculture and highly intensified industrial forms of animal husbandry. And that obviously informs a lot of my choices about what I'm prepared to eat. But absolutely recognize the position many, many people in the world are in terms of sourcing food and their ability to source food, where their relationship with, animals is extremely important, but also recognizing the actual respect that they have for those animals and the reverence with which they treat them, and also the sustainable ways in which they manage that relationship with those animals, would not present me with a problem, for example, if I was faced with the same situation today. I don't see the two as the same kind of thing. We're in an enviable position to have choices and to be able to make choices about, we have the greater access to food than people in the history of humans have ever had. And so we're in that enviable position of being able to choose what we want to eat and therefore being able to have the luxury of allowing our beliefs and ideals to inform the way we want to eat.
On that comment about being able to choose what we want to eat, before recording, we spoke about the growth in wealth over time and that influencing the choice of people's diets. I'm interested to open that up a little bit more. But just before we do, I'd like to ask you why you do what you do. I want to try to broaden it into what really connects you into the work that you do now. What inspires you to wake up in the morning and do the work you do?
Yeah, look, I think food in itself is a fascinating subject, whether you're coming at it from the point of view of food technology, food provision, or history, the history of cuisine, why we eat what we eat, why in some cultures an animal that we treat and love as a pet is food in another culture and the complete opposite in ours. Why we hate some animals and revere some others. This fascinating history of our relationship to animals. So that's always been something that's interested me as a philosopher, interested me as someone who's interested in human anthropology, philosophical anthropology, how we define who we are, which is always a definition of us in contrast to what we're not. And very often we think about humans in the context of what we would and wouldn't eat. And very often a kind of definition of who we are relates strongly to the food we eat. But food is there every day. It's vital. It's important. We need it constantly. And the history of civilization, the history of growth, the history of our relationships is all about food. Food is a fascinating conduit for taking whatever you want to study, whether it's philosophy, whether it's history, whether it's geography, whether it's technology, whether it's science. And it's a nice catalyst for all those interests. So I've been drawn, from the early days when I was interested in the political economy of food and interested in food and culture and interested in diet and nutrition because I was working predominantly with sports nutritionists, sports scientists and so on, right through to now and the huge changes that are happening in our industrial food systems and the requirements for change because of a growing human population and our recognition of the impact that agriculture has on the environment and land use and water use and everything else and climate change. It just all comes together. So it's been a really opportune time for me to bring all my interests together and go, this is an area where I've landed because it's fascinating to me.
Talk to me about, just so that we can connect this, about the work that you do now. So let's open that up a little bit more. You mentioned that this is a great opportunity to bring those interests together. Talk to me about Food Frontier and what you guys do.
Yeah, so first and foremost, Food Frontier is an independent think tank. So we're not an industry body. We are an objective, independent, sort of research-focused and insights-focused organisation, which is addressing the challenges that the globe and human population are going to face over the next 25 years as global population rises to close to 10 billion people by 2050. And the current unsustainability of our existing industrial food practices that have survived for largely 10,000 years and are now beginning to be stretched to their limit as to what we can do. The amount of land on the planet that is given over to agriculture, not just to growing plants that we need, but growing the plants to feed the animals that we need, is getting to the point where it's causing real problems. There's different problems with deforestation. It's causing problems with what we call water eutrophication. That's the pollution of our waterways, either from animal excrement and so on, but also from other deposits like the phosphorus in their diet that's leaching into the waterways and system, causing things like blue-green algae and various other things. So we're seeing the impact of our food systems globally, not least on things like climate change. So Food Frontier is really set up to investigate the potential of what we call alternative proteins. Some people call them complementary proteins, but that is finding alternative sources of protein to nourish humans and nourish them well with good quality protein that's an alternative to some of our traditional sources of protein in our diet. And through that, to help mitigate climate change, to help mitigate things like the transmission of zoonotic diseases from our intensive animal agriculture practices, and to mitigate issues around antibiotic resistance that we're using so heavily in intensive agriculture of things like pigs and chickens. So a number of issues that we think that seeking alternative sources of protein are going to be help mitigate. And these are really significant challenges we know that in the next 10, 15 years, the number of people who die from diseases where they have antibiotic resistance far outweigh the number of people who died from COVID, for example. And so it's becoming a really serious issue. We've just had that pandemic. We know there will be future pandemics of transmission of diseases from animals to humans, and they're largely perpetuated through intensive agriculture of putting large volumes of animals in close proximity to each other, etc. So the next big attack of Asian flu, swine flu, bird flu could be very devastating. And as soon as those things transfer to humans, we've got another global pandemic, and we've seen what problems that causes. So food is really a central focus for dealing with a lot of the challenges, the big challenges facing society today.
Where are we at in that journey to improve things?
Well, it's interesting. You can look at this from both sides of the coin. On the one hand, the understanding of the relationship between our food systems and things like climate change is, from the point of view of the general population, very poor. Research from the US, from Europe, from here tells us that, whenever climate change is talked about in the press, for example, we talk about fossil fuels and the fossil fuel industry, and only about 6 or 7% of coverage covers food systems and the impact of methane production on climate change, etc. So we know that on the one hand, we're only at the very beginning of the associations between our industrial food agricultural systems and these big issues is being taken seriously. On the other hand, we are seeing these now being recognized at big global international agendas, whether it's COP and various other meetings, and governments beginning to feel they need to do it. I mean, we're not as advanced in Australia as Europe. Very progressive authorities in Europe are leaning heavily into government regulation and incentivization around the production of food. So it is beginning to change. We're on that cusp of change.
Why do you think it's not been as talked about? Food has been. What are you seeing?
Well, first of all, I think the association of food with some of these problems is relatively new. Now, of course, the people who've been studying it for 20, 30, 40 years, it's not new to them, same as climate change wasn't new to people who were looking at it 50 years ago. But to us, it's relatively new. And so I think there's a difference between things that we do that are discretionary, whether we drive our big SUVs out into the countryside at the weekend to go camping, compared to putting food on our plate every day because we need food. There's a very different kind of mindset around that. And so I think it's quite challenging for people to have to think about, do I personally, on a personal level, need to change my diet? Or even then from a government point of view, really it's not going to be a vote winner. Government's telling people what they should and shouldn't eat. It's proven to not be a vote winner. And so it's challenging, but it's coming.
Simon, when you say that, I think of a couple of things relating to the SUV versus the meal. And one is people can choose not to drive somewhere, or, they could walk or they could cycle or do all these other things. But with a meal, they think, I've got to eat. So I can imagine that that's something that has influenced the difference in what's being discussed as well. It's more obvious to think, these things cause pollution versus these things that people think are a necessity. Is that something that's come up in the conversation before?
Yeah, well, it's two things here. The first is we're just focusing on climate change on that particular topic. But climate change has been very much framed in the public imagination around carbon dioxide. And whilst, of course, every industry has emissions as a result of carrying out that industry, certainly in agriculture, a lot of the big emissions are around factories and factory emissions, but in the supply chain, transportation and various other things. So, of course, everybody has a carbon dioxide footprint. But what we haven't done in talking about climate change, a lot of is talked about the impact of methane in the atmosphere, of nitrogen in the atmosphere, of phosphorus and so on in the soil and in the waterways. These things are becoming more predominant. But when you go back to that issue about the SUVs versus, the food we eat, we now know that our SUV is, and particularly our utility SUV, is the biggest selling vehicle in Australia. Now, that wouldn't have been the case 20 years ago. Something small like a Toyota Corolla, for example, would have been the biggest selling car. And people still went on their camping holidays. They just took their saloon cars with them, towing their trailer tent. It's simply that we've made a personal lifestyle choice about our desire for these big, hunky, chunky SUVs. And it's a cultural thing. And it's a fashion thing, although that I don't mean that to downplay it. It is a cultural thing about the way we choose to do these things. I don't think we've suddenly become bush campers, whereas we weren't before. It's just we have a vehicle that fits that whole persona. Food is entirely different, and food is very strongly related to people's individual identity and their cultural roots and grounding And although we live in a very cosmopolitan society, and that's expressed more than anything else through the food we eat and the diversity of our diets, most people in the course of 2 or 3 weeks of eating will probably eat cuisines from 4 or 5 or 6 different cultures, whether they're eating Thai food or Chinese food or Italian food or whatever. And of course, we've got a large influence in this country from the Middle East with Lebanese food and so on, and Greek food. So cuisine is very strongly tied to people's heritage and culture, and it brings people together, and it's an important binder that brings families together about the way in which we conduct these rituals. And it's very, very ritualistic. Eating, breakfast, lunch, dinner, and having a family dinner, everybody sitting at the table, we're still very embedded in the ritual of eating, which has very, very strong meaning and significance for people. It's very difficult to change that. Whereas the fashion as to whether you drive a Ute or whether you drive your Holden Commodore or whatever is a temporal thing.
Something that I touched on before that I'd like to open up a little bit more is around the idea that as wealth increases, and historically as wealth has increased, people have wanted to eat what the wealthy people have eaten. Can you tell me a bit more about this?
Absolutely. There's a fantastic book. So if any of your listeners get into this, it's Rachel Loudon's book, Cuisine and Empire, is a great history of the relationship with food production and cooking and empire. We know historically that for as long as we've been civilized, that is, living in one place in towns, cities, et cetera, we have been grain-eating peoples. So the majority of our calories, the majority of our nutrition has come from the available grains. And if you look at the migration and settlement of people around the planet, they've followed corridors where grains grow freely. And whether those grains are barley or wheat or corn or soy or sorghum or whatever, we can see the way population is diversified around the ability to be able to grow grains and live off grains. We've supplemented our diet with animal protein, and typically that's small animals, whether it's birds, whether it's small mammals, and they've formed a fairly small part of our diet. Because they're difficult to farm, and until farming became a dominant part of our agriculture, difficult to catch, required a great deal of exertion of energy and effort and time. And so they've always been considered to be a luxury, if you like. And of course, the wealthier you are and the more able you are to acquire those sorts of foods, then the wealthy have always had a better diet. And that better diet has been reflected in a greater consumption of things like animal protein. So the lower income, the poorer people in any culture and society have always aspired to any growth in wealth as being a change in diet. And it's one of the worrying things for us in terms of growth of human population. It's not just the fact that we will have another 2 billion people on the planet, but those 2 billion people will largely come in countries in the African continent and Asia. And there are a lot of developing nations in those areas where individuals are becoming increasingly relatively wealthier. And that aspiration of to have more animal protein as center of plate protein in their diet and to mimic wealthy countries is a worry. Because it isn't just about increasing population, it's actually about increasing the volume of animal protein those people aspire to want to eat. Because we know from history that the cuisine of the elite, whether it's the religious elite or whether it is the ruling elite in terms of the aristocracy or however you want to view it, has always driven changes in cuisine and fashions in cuisine. We now have pretty much a world domination almost of what we call the Anglo-American cuisine that emerged in the 1700s and spread through colonization, which we metaphorically call the beef and bread cuisine. A hamburger is a typical example. It's largely based on animal protein, typically beef, with bread products and also some caffeinated products, so the growth of tea and coffee and so on, and then in cola drinks and sugar. And the growth in the sugar industry in an ingredient and a commodity that was virtually unknown outside of wealthy circles before the 1700s and 1800s. And even by the end of the 19th century, sugar's still relatively expensive as a commodity. Now it's in everything. And if it's not sugar, it's high fructose corn syrup and so on. So we now have this cuisine that's been driven by inaccessibility to the majority and being seen as the food of the elite, which is very much center of plate animal protein with some vegetables, with bread products, with caffeine products, tea, coffee, and sugared products, whether it's in our desserts and sweets and cakes and pastries and so on. And that's become a dominant global cuisine.
Something that you mentioned to me before we started recording was around the history of this distinction that we make between the words we use to describe our food versus the animal.
It's a really important debate because, of course, the traditional meat and dairy industry has pushed back against the alternative protein industries from calling their products meat or calling them milk. And it's a very interesting history. If you're somebody who wants to get into that etymology and origin of our terms, it's quite fascinating. And it's actually quite the opposite of what we think. Milk, for example, as a word comes from the verb, the action of milking. And typically that has involved the action of milking the teat of an animal, no matter what it is, and deriving that milk. So milk as the product is the product of milking. And so it's become known as that term. Now we readily talk about plant-based milks. We talk about oat milk, we talk about almond milk, soy milk, and so on. And of course, the industry has been very threatened in some respects by that, because plant-based milks now operate probably globally in the region of 25, 26% of total milk consumption, because people view milk as a discretionary product that they drink or use for its flavor and the other experience they get from it, as opposed to post-Second World War, for example, where governments pushed milk consumption as a source of protein in the absence of animal protein in difficult times in the 50s or 60s. And so milk and eggs were pushed and advanced as a vital source of protein. I went to school with free school milk. But now milk is not seen in the same way by people. It's just something to put on your cereal or put in your smoothie or put in your tea or coffee. And if the other things taste as good and taste as nice, I'm not wedded to dairy milk necessarily. And of course, a lot of people have allergies and a lot of people have problems with lactose intolerance and so on. Human beings are generally lactose intolerant. We've had to develop the protein to enable us to digest lactose readily. Asian cultures and communities don't have a history of that lactose tolerance, whereas Western cultures do. So it's interesting, the ownership of the word milk. But it's even more interesting, the ownership of the word meat. Meat has always meant, for hundreds of years, solid food, meat and drink. Meat is the solid food. And we've often associated that with the solid food that comes from a vegetable or a fruit. We might talk about the meat of a coconut, and we're talking about that solid food from the inside the coconut shell. And what's interesting is that the association of meat exclusively with animal protein probably didn't enter into English language until the 1300s, 1400s. And a large change came about, certainly in Western culture, I'm talking about, with the Norman conquest of England. Prior to that, and we can still see it in our language, the animals that we rear, we still use some of those Anglo-Saxon and Viking terms for. So we talk about oxen, we talk about cattle, we talk about the cow. But when we talk about the meat from those animals, we use the Norman French word. So when we talk about the meat from a cow, we talk about beef. And because the Norman aristocracy wanted to distinguish itself from the peasantry and talk about the food that they had access to, which was different. It was the high quality forms of beef that you got. I mean, a lot of the peasantry, if they ate any animal meat, it was the offal. An offdal is the word of that which falls away from the flesh. So all of the intestines and internal organs that fell away from the solid muscular flesh was the offdal, and mete was the solid meat. And so because we then started to talk about things like beef and lamb and pork, these are words that don't describe an animal, although lamb obviously is a baby sheep. It's very different from what the peasantry were eating, which was mutton or whatever the old term was. So you had this linguistic distinction that was very much an aristocratic one. If you were aristocracy, you ate beef and lamb and pork. You did not eat mutton, or you did not eat offal, and you did not eat the meat of the cow. You called it something else. And it's quite an interesting distinction, because it's then meant that from about the 1300s, 1400s onwards, we've had this association of meat only with animal protein. And so then there's this question now as, does that industry own that term? And of course, it's had its most prominent visibility in pressure against governments to not allow plant-based meat manufacturers to call their product meat, and certainly not to call it, plant-based chicken or plant-based beef, i.e. not to refer to it as if it is from a chicken or from a cow. And of course, there's been a lot of self-regulation of the industry to not mislead, and a lot of research that's done to show that consumers aren't actually misled. But here's where we are. Here's where we are. We have a lot of debate at the moment around ownership of these words, which have very interesting histories and roots.
To step back from that and look at it more broadly, I want to take us back over to the work that you do with Food Frontier and what the think tank actually does. For those out there, some may be very familiar with what think tanks are, but for those that aren't, talk to me about some of the things that you do as a think tank in this industry.
Yeah, so largely what we do is some primary research, but largely secondary research. We're drawing on a lot of research and data insights from others, but we're putting them into our sort of thought leadership around what this means for the growth of the alternative protein sector. And that alternative protein sector is represented in probably 3 different sort of technologies. The first I've just mentioned is plant-based meats, and most people now will be familiar with the availability of these products. You can go into your retailer and there'll be a section where you can get an alternative burger. Now, traditionally, those were in the vegetarian section, for want of a better term, in the supermarket. You'd be looking at falafels and tofu, but there'd also be veggie burgers and things. Whereas for about the last 5-6 years, there's been a growth of a market trying to supply an alternative analog to the meat product. So instead of a beef burger, a plant-based meat burger that simulates and represents the same thing as the beef burger, with an attempt to produce the functionality of that burger, you can use it on a barbecue or whatever, but also the taste and texture. So that's the plant-based meat industry, and they've been very successful with things like utility foods like burgers and sausages and mince, less successful in the whole cuts or the sort of chunk style of beef chunks, beef strips, chicken strips that you might want to cook in a casserole or a curry or a stew. But they're getting there. The second technology that we're interested in, which is showing to be extremely promising for future food supply, is an area we call precision fermentation. This is part of what we call cellular agriculture. Now, cellular agriculture is not new, and precision fermentation is not new. I mean, the obvious example of precision fermentation is the growth of synthetic insulin. Prior to synthetic insulin being developed in the 1970s, we relied very much on drawing insulin from dogs and pigs. So it was real insulin from the pancreases of those animals that we could then use. And there were obviously issues with some people rejecting it and so on. And then we worked out how to actually take the important individual cells that we needed from insulin and basically brewing them like we do in any other fermentation industry. So you can take a small volume of it and add a feedstock, whether that be a yeast or a bacteria or an algae, something that replicates itself very quickly and very fast, that bonds to it and basically grows that individual specific ingredient. That's why it's precision, because we're precisely focusing on one small ingredient as opposed to a broad food stuff like a yogurt or a cheese or whatever, all of which come through fermentation processes. So that use of precision fermentation is proving extremely promising because, very simply, you have the possibility of almost endless or limitless production of an ingredient from a very small source. So, of course, from the point of view of supply to feed a growing population. Now, it's very different from plant-based meat. We're not growing an end product. We're growing an ingredient. So that ingredient could be a dairy protein like lactoferrin, which is very important in processed cheese production, for example, and is very expensive to produce because you're taking milk from a cow, dehydrating it, extracting the specific protein you want, rehydrating it, putting it into a different product. So there's a huge amount of wastage in the whole system, huge amount of cost in the whole system, and supply issues in terms of being able to get the volumes of lactoferrin you need for a very big industry like a processed cheese industry for putting cheese on pizzas or putting cheese on, on your burgers and so on. So lactoferrin is hugely expensive, anywhere between sort of $1,000 plus per kilo, with only about 500 tons produced globally in any one year. So the opportunities to grow that protein or to grow whey proteins and make and ferment milk without having to milk a cow, or casein and grow other forms of cheese like whole cheese like a mozzarella to ferment that instead of taking it from cow's milk. But we can do it with all sorts of other ingredients. We can do it potentially with coffee. You can do it, there's one company doing it with stevia, the natural sweetener taken from stevia leaves. Instead of harvesting millions of tons of leaves, you just take the cellular level, the ingredient from the leaves, and you ferment it and produce massive volumes of it. So as an opportunity to almost grow a limitless amount of food from nothing, if you think of it that way, it's a tremendous opportunity for how we're going to feed people in the future. But you're growing ingredients. And of course, the big impact of that is if those ingredients mean I don't need our traditional forms of supply, which might be damaging the environment in some way, then this is a huge benefit, not just from the point of view of supply of the product, but in terms of mitigation against some of the issues associated with the traditional forms of producing that. So precision fermentation holds a lot of promise, and it's a technology that's well proven. It's not like novel or new or some kind of science fiction. It's a totally well proven and safe technology. It's just now being applied to different foodstuffs.
You mentioned a couple of examples there. Is there anything that's available in the market now that a consumer could go out and try?
Well, it depends where you live.
Let's say in Australia, given that we're...
In Australia, no, but there will be very soon. There's a couple of companies. One that comes to mind in Victoria is Eden Brew. And Eden Brew have been in the news quite a lot in the last couple of years. They are precision fermenting whey protein, and their first product in market, possibly by the end of this year or certainly in 2025, will be ice cream. That is effectively dairy ice cream in the sense of it's exactly the same as a dairy ice cream, but it's not involved any of the dairy industry in its production. It's a precision fermented whey protein that's used to create the mouthfeel and the taste and texture of what we normally expect with dairy ice cream. Of course, there are alternative plant-based ice creams like coconut ice cream and so on, but this is for people who want the dairy experience in their ice cream. So yes, there are a couple of companies, and Perfect Day in the US is already producing ice cream from precision fermentation, but we will start to potentially see things like baby formula, baby powders or whatever that need the nutritional requirement of that lactoferrin in them for all sorts of antimicrobial resistance that you build up in influence and various other things that we'll probably see those launching into a lot of those areas in the next couple of years. It's here, it's now. The analogy that's been used by one of the people in the industry that I think resonates with me is we've basically proven that things made out of steel can fly. So, we've proven that airplanes can exist. So the science is done. There's no longer the question of, it'll never work. But what we now need to do is build all the airports, build all the infrastructure, build all the manufacturing to build more and more planes. And that's where we're at with precision fermentation. So it requires a lot of investment to build the kinds of facilities at scale that are going to be able to produce this product at scale to have an impact. And then the third area that's a little bit further in the future in terms of its realization as a commercially available product is what we call cultivated meat. And that's been in the news quite a lot because it has a little bit more of that interest and appeal in terms of, wow, this is fascinating. But again, the use of our scientific methodologies for cell culturation has been around for 120 years. This is not new science, but the application of it to grow meat cells. So to take a small scraping, for example, from an animal, which doesn't harm the animal or damage the animal, and then multiply those cells in a bioreactor to produce very, very large volumes of something that at the cellular level is identical to animal meat, is a technology that's now proven. And again, we're looking at how you get it to a scale and cost that make it viable or as a food product that people can enjoy. One Australian company, Vow, has an application with faisans in Australia and food standards to have it acceptable to sell in Australia, but it's just been approved to sell in Singapore. It's now selling in restaurants in Singapore. And that is an example of cultivated meat.
That was only because they just turned 5 this week.
Yes.
At the time of recording, they've just announced that as well. So it's perfect for this moment to mention.
The existence of the industry, I think, is an important reflection of where we're at with this relationship between industry and the consumer. We know that the majority of consumers want their animal protein. That's what they're used to. They know how to work with it, cook with it, provide for their family. They understand it. And so it's very difficult to shift people. We know, for example, that no matter what powers of persuasion you use, increasing the number of vegans in the world is extremely difficult. It's fixed at a relatively small percentage of the population. And that's partly because of association of what it stands for, but even vegetarians, fixed at a certain percentage. So no matter how much we talk about the health benefits or even the environmental benefits of a plant-based diet, it's going to be difficult to shift those. So what we do want to try to do is give people what they want, or rather what the industry wants to do is give people what they want in a form that they want, which is animal meat, but do it in a way that's less harmful or less damaging, and also potentially with greater sort of productivity gains to feed a growing population. So in 30, 40 years' time, we could be in a situation where the majority of meat supply in terms of utility foods, whether it's meatballs or mince or whatever, is cultivated and not coming directly from an animal.
While that shift occurs, it's obviously a challenging experience for people to wrap their head around when people hear things around like labs, things are happening in labs and it's being grown. And I imagine that there's a bit of a hurdle in some people's minds to wrap their head around that, which must be some of the work that you're doing, speaking with these sorts of businesses as well, helping them to overcome these challenges.
Absolutely. I mean, there's two sides to that. One is the consumer research that we're involved with, and that is that reflective of what people really think? And you'd be surprised, actually. People who don't know much about it are a bit hesitant and resistant, but people who get told about it go, that's actually interesting. I'll try that. So there is a curiosity. And then obviously talking to the media as one, but also the industry itself about the way in which you talk about this industry. I mean, you mentioned lab there. Well, there's no more of a relationship to these production technologies, whether it's precision fermentation or cultivated meat, to a laboratory than any other form of food production. And you look at a breakfast cereal, a breakfast cereal is tested, developed with research and development in what you and I might think of as a laboratory, but is a facility where you can test this with multiple bits and pieces of equipment. It's a factory. It's effectively a factory. Nearly all our food comes from a factory-style supply chain, apart from fruit and veg that's come out of the ground or off a tree, and some animal products, but typically the whole cuts. If it's turned into a meatball or a nugget, it's come through a factory. So our food production is very factory orientated, and these new technologies are just the same. And the R&D and the kind of science behind the development of a new, muesli bar or granola bar or a new breakfast cereal is no different than the kinds of science and technology go in terms of facility. So we try to avoid talking about, lab grown. It's not really representative of what's happening. Now, we don't talk about lab brewed beer that's come from a brewery or whiskey come from a distillery. We readily accept the kinds of the infrastructure and the fascinating technology in terms of these big vats and processes going on, but it doesn't put us off. We don't stop drinking our beer because it's come through this scientific process, and we shouldn't be put off by, cultivated meat and precision fermentation. So we've got to work with the media around the way it presents, but of course that draws people's attention. So there's a way of communicating that that they'd rather get the attention and the clickbait, if you like, than the reality, which is really rather dull and boring.
Yeah, it's important to make that distinction, which is why I bring it up as well. And I really liked your answer about it, to elaborate on the realities of meat in this industry. So yeah, whether it's plant-based, cell-based, very, very interesting. So I appreciate you sharing that as well.
And of course, if we look at what's happening in the food world at the moment, there are two really big sort of conversations going on. One is around ultra-processed foods. And there's a lot of misinformation, disinformation that's perpetuated by some industries as a weapon against another industry, i.e. that industry is ultra-processed and that's bad for you, shouldn't do it. A lot of misinformation about ultra-processed foods. But there's also the whole, on the opposite side, the sort of clean food campaign. So very much from a health and nutrition perspective, about people wanting more clean food. So consumers, and it's not a big percentage, we might be talking 20, 25, 26%, 30%, depending on the country, the region, whatever, of what we call conscious consumers, people who make their food choices for conscious reasons, either through interests in health, nutrition, or environmental concerns, or ideological concerns about where the food has come from. And so the big push at the moment is around things like ultra-processed foods, which is fascinating. Because if you took a fruit like a pineapple and you broke it down scientifically into the constituent parts of that fresh fruit that has gone through no processing other than to cut it open and chunk it up and put it in your bowl, you'd get an ingredient list of about 20, 30 ingredients when you break down the different acids, the different micronutrients in it. And if you put them as a list, you go, oh my God, it's an ultra-processed food. Of course it's an ultra-processed food, because that ingredient list has not come through a process. So we've got to do a lot of work around how we are talking about ultra-processed foods and how you determine whether an ultra-processed food is good or bad. A lot of fortified breads are ultra-processed foods, but they're fundamentally good in that they're more nutritious, healthier, more fiber, more protein than an alternative bread. And yet, because of those additions, they're now classed as ultra-processed.
As obviously you're an organization that does that research, that looks into these things and finds these answers, how can your regular consumer navigate this misinformation in the market and solve these problems for themselves, these questions for themselves on what they should be eating?
It's a really important question. We focus very much on influencing, say, government or the industry themselves in the way in which they market and package and do what they do, venture capitalists, and giving them the information and knowledge they need to make decisions about where there is safe investment with good return that is actually promoting what they might be interested in promoting. When it comes down to the consumer, of course, it's very difficult to get to the consumer, but then do more than just change one opinion at a time. So in terms of the value of our work, we don't really focus on the consumer. However, you're absolutely right. We are going to need better education better education of school teachers who are involved in talking about nutrition and diet, whether that's from the point of view of, home economics and cooking, or whether it's from the point of view of, biology lessons and chemistry lessons or whatever else. We're going to need to better educate chefs who are working in quick service restaurants and the food industry to actually be aware of what they're cooking and using, particularly as they want to focus on more nutritional menus and so on, and whether they use plant-based meats or not and so on. So there is a lot of work to be done on educating people in all sorts of ways. The least effective is directly trying to educate the consumer. But what we do need to do very much is work with the media, work with other outlets that are publishing information for that the consumer does see, read, hear, and get the message out there and get people at least thinking and becoming curious and wanting to find out for themselves. But you know how difficult this is. We live in an era of social media where your sources of information aren't necessarily guaranteed to be factual or truthful. That, every source has an agenda, and, whether it's shared on Facebook or TikTok or Instagram or whatever else, they're not reliable necessarily as sources. So it's a big challenge. And going back to the earlier talk about, people being influenced by the diet of the wealthy or the powerful, I think as you see food service, and we're seeing signs of it, whether it's school meals or institutional meals in hospitals or whatever, as you see those things adopt more sustainable offerings and nutritional offerings, and people become accustomed to it, and it becomes familiar. Because a lot of us reproduce at home what we've experienced in those environments. Nobody at home started cooking beef burgers for themselves. They decided at home, I'll replicate what we bought at the beef burger joint. Down the corner, and the family love it. I mean, back in America in the 1960s or whatever, you could even buy the cardboard boxes so you could sit at home and eat it out of a cardboard box instead of off of a plate with a knife and fork. So our experience of food very often comes from eating out. And so as we see those things change, you'll begin to see that awareness and influence, I think, on the general consumer.
I'm wondering, Simon, who you look to for advice, whether that's personally or professionally as an organisation. I'd love to know where you look for advice.
Well, the thing about the kind of organisation we are as a think tank is that we look at disparate sources of specific information that we can pull together and create thought leadership. So it's not looking to one person or one area for influence, because if they've got the answers, then we're not needed in that respect. So we draw on a lot of intelligence from the people in the industry themselves. So understanding these technologies, particularly from the very, very inspired founders and CEOs of some of these startups who, have a wealth of knowledge and understanding and information. So we get technical information from those people. We're driven and inspired by ideas from thought leaders in the different areas. So mentioning a couple of names, personal favorite of mine is George Monbiot. So George Monbiot is, one of our sort of leading researchers and thinkers around fungi. And so I look for interesting perspectives and ideas from some of these thinkers in different areas. There's a researcher who's also trained as a chef but does a lot around food and the psychology of food. Beatrice Wilson, B. Wilson, her name is, from Cambridge University. So, there are these thinkers who I try to get ideas from and pull them together and synthesize them. And that's really the job of us as a think tank, to get data and insights and from a lot of stakeholders, and then to put them back out to the stakeholders and continue to refine them into sort of thought leadership. So it's not about any one person in that regard. That's really our role and function, is to analyze and synthesize and push out thought leadership that can influence change.
I'm wondering what you're experiencing friction with, and I ask it in that way deliberately to see where the guest goes. I'm wondering where you take your answer, but what is it that you're experiencing friction with at the moment?
Well, depending on how you want to interpret friction, there's friction in the terms of general, not deliberate resistance, but inertia, and overcoming that inertia in change, whether that's from getting the government to lean into incentivization, reform, regulatory change, and so on. In one part, what I call inertia, getting the people who could play a big part in change, moving them to do something. There's friction very much around resistance, and that resistance is proactive resistance. So there's a lot going on at the moment around pushback from other industries that feel threatened by the development of alternative proteins, and want to push their agenda in ways that meet the interests of the consumer so that they can prevent any large growth in something that might threaten that industry. Some of that I think is misguided. I don't think there is a big threat to some of these industries, and most of them, in fact, the big players in these industries are investing in these different technologies themselves because they see it as a future potential for their own industry. So there's friction there. But I think there's also friction between our position as an independent think tank and a body that might be on the other extreme, an activist body, for example. So particularly pushing a line of action that it wants. And that might produce a greater impact in some respects, but is very much positioned around an ideological framework or whatever. So a challenge for a think tank is to remain independent and objective and not be seen as necessarily hand in glove with a specific set of stakeholders or a specific industry, and actually calls out the negative and the positive. But the friction, therefore, is around the capacity of that think tank to generate change. And it's always a challenge for a not-for-profit that operates on what we call a theory of change. How do we measure our impact? Because we're doing it in a certain way that is trying to, as I said, influence a number of people through objective, independent analysis. And it's very different than what you might try to do if you were campaigning or you were an industry body or whatever else. And so whether that's a friction or not, it's always a challenge for an organisation such as ours.
Thank you for sharing that, Simon. I just have one last question for you today, and that's, who would you like to hear on the show?
Oh, well, that's an interesting question. Well, I would love it if we could resurrect people from the dead,
Nice.
That would be nice. So there's a whole list of people in history. I mean, my top one would be Charles Darwin.
You're a bit of a history buff as well.
Bit of a history buff, but also, a great, fascinating interest in people who I think have been some of the most influential people in the world, and Darwin would be one of my favourites. But if you took that to present day, there are a number of philosophers who work in that intersection between philosophy, ethology, anthropology, and so on. Daniel Dennett springs to mind, the American philosopher of consciousness. So there's some big names there that I'd be interested in having on your podcast. There's all the obvious ones, people like Peter Singer, who've worked for a long time in this field. And I've mentioned people like George Monbiot and so on. Another person I think it'd be great to have on your show, if you can ever get hold of her, is Hannah Ritchie. Hannah Ritchie is the chief researcher for Our World in Data. So she's been exposed to a huge volume of data around all the issues we've talked about. She'd be a fascinating podcaster participant.
Thank you very much, Simon. It's been a pleasure having you on. I've learned so much in our conversation, and before it as well, you've spent a lot of incredible time with me today. So I really appreciate the time that you've spent with me.
You're
Simon,
welcome. It's been a lot of fun.
This program was produced by H Media. We'll see you soon.